Thank you, everybody. I love that you guys all want to talk to each other so much. Hopefully we've built in a little more time this year than we have in past years to get that done. But I am absolutely thrilled to introduce what's going to be our last conversation of the day. And it's a conversation I've been looking forward to for the whole conference. I think it's going to wrap up and incorporate a lot of the themes that we've been talking about over the course of the conference. So I'm going to first introduce our two panelists and then show a short video about their work, and then we'll dive into some conversation. But I am thrilled to be joined on stage by David McCullough III. There he is, CEO and co-founder of the American Exchange Project. If his name is familiar, of course, it's because he shares it with his grandfather, the very famous and beloved historian. I'm not going to go into a lot of how David got to where he is, because I think that your story about how you came to found EAP is something I really want to talk about. But I will just note that he was, in 2022, named one of Forbes' 30 under 30 list of in education. And he really just has put together an amazing program that I'm excited to share with you and talk about what we can learn from. To his left, Adar Cohen is a mediator, an educator, an advisor in conflict zones in private sector, including healthcare systems. He has a PhD in conflict resolution. He's been working with AEP, but has also just worked with a host of folks in helping people have hard, difficult, big conversations. His work has been featured in the New York Times, MSNBC. He's been on the TED stage, and is most recently featured in David Brooks's last book. And full disclosure, Adar and I worked together a while ago in Chicago, and he has been one of my lifelong friends and fellow travelers, so it's a really special treat to have him be here with me to talk about the work that he and David are doing. So with that, Rachel, we're going to show a real quick video, like I said, just to give you a little introduction to this amazing program, the American Exchange Project, and then we'll dive into conversation.
Divisions define the moment: political, cultural, geographic. Differences we once celebrated now polarize us. But too often we shun each other because we don't know each other. We need to rediscover our shared humanity, and young people can lead the way. What if students from Palo Alto and the Bronx got to taste the best barbecue in Kilgore, Texas? What if teenagers from Jackson, Mississippi and Jackson, Georgia could summit a rocky mountain or brave the Salmon River? Or if kids from Sheridan, Wyoming and Dodge City, Kansas could cross the Brooklyn Bridge? What if we all had the chance to make a lifelong friend from a faraway place? What if American adulthood began with an adventure that brought us all closer together? The American Exchange Project. We send high school seniors in the summer after graduation on a free week-long trip to an American town or city radically different from their own. Our travelers stay with open-hearted host families, soak up local culture, forge life-changing friendships, and come to love a new community and the people who call it home. We're stitching our country together, one student, one high school, one hometown at a time. Come travel with us.
Thanks a lot for that. I mean, I think that's, it gets me every time too. It's just so in the vein of so much of what we've been talking about over the last 2 days. And I'm going to draw out some of those themes, but maybe I'll start with the fact that when we started the conference, I was sharing with my friends out there that I was coming into the conference heartbroken a little bit about where we are in this country and the divisions and the strife, and it's all so much, and the human suffering, and that I knew that I would come away, as I always do, from being with these folks for 2 days, really filled with more hope and a belief in the fact that our collective work to solve problems would win the day, which I am going to do. But I think that this is such a great note to end on, because it feels like you guys are really having an impact in a long-term goal of healing divisions, bringing people together. So I think I just want to start with maybe, David, how you got into this work and what you were trying to accomplish with this program.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for having me, and why I'm on stage when all of you are here is baffling to me, so very grateful to be here. So a little bit of a fluke. So in the fall of 2015, the potent combination of a hurt shoulder and no talent had me fresh off the Yale baseball team. And I was a junior in college at the time and had spent my whole life loving the game and kind of was fumbling around to figure out what was next for me. And I fell into a program at the university called the Studies in Grand Strategy. And it runs from your junior spring into your senior fall, and had an endowment and would fund students to do a research project on basically whatever they wanted in the summer between the 2 semesters. So at the time, I was very interested in issues of education in some of our most impoverished communities. And the more I'd read about it, the more I'd learned, the more I was teaching in different schools in New Haven. And first off, it always bugged me that folks at Yale were so uninvolved in the community of New Haven when we could have had such a huge impact. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for those who are. And it seemed that there was something off in the grand strategy of how we educate our nation's poorest children. And it also frustrated me that the more I read, the more I realized that folks weren't talking to or basing their ideas and opinions on the hard work and the wisdom of teachers and children and parents, folks in the middle of the issue. So I borrowed my mom's car and spent that summer driving 7,000 miles across the country, and spent weeks in Cotulla, Texas, and Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and the Slavic Village in Cleveland, which, for those who don't know, is one of the more blighted neighborhoods of that city. I was welcomed everywhere I went. David McCullough III of Andover, Yale, and Cambridge, high up in the ivory tower I grew up. I did not think these were the sorts of places that would be open-minded to someone like me or where I was coming from. I was welcomed everywhere. I made great friends, and I did all that in the summer of 2016. So while I was making my way around the country, so too were the Trump and Clinton campaigns. And I came home to my world of Boston and Yale with really sort of visceral lessons learned that I could not have learned in the lecture halls. And in many ways, it was the most profound educational experience I'd ever had. Great friends and a deep understanding of where this country's divisions were actually coming from. Fast forward 2 years, I was out at lunch with a professor from that program, Paul Solomon. For those who watch the PBS NewsHour, he's been the economics correspondent there for about 40 years. And we were discussing how division in America really is the greatest issue in the world. Because so long as we're not able to talk to each other, so long as we're not able to find compromise and common ground and kind of move forward on these critical issues, we're going to be stalled. The whole machine, the whole apparatus of the way this country is supposed to work, which is really the kind of center of the world in so many ways, is going to be kind of clogged. And we needed to figure out how to reconcile our differences. And at the time, it was 2018, and everyone in every academy that we were a part of was obsessed with figuring out why the problem was the way it was, but no one had a clue as to what solution could be done. So we kicked off a research project that day. I volunteered to be the kid, moved home, told my parents I'd be spending their very expensive tuition money on starting a nonprofit with someone they never met before. You should have seen the looks on their faces when I told them that. But they offered the fold-out couch in the attic and the plastic folding table. That became the world headquarters of the American Exchange Project for a few years. And we launched a research project into what social innovation can scale up right now and bring our country back together again. And that 6-month project really yielded a few key lessons. First, that to bring together any divided group of people on any line, political or otherwise, it really helps to do a thing, to have a common goal, to work together. That can be as simple as setting up chairs in a conference room or a larger service project or playing on a sports team, but you got to get up and do something. And what was unique in America is that thing couldn't be marketed on a "Hey America, let's come together" pitch, because then only the people that wanted to do that would show up, and they're arguably not the most critical audience for something like this. We also realized that as we talked to more and more Americans, and we were canvassing the whole country, that the issues they were so passionate about, they weren't talking about them kind of from their heads as much as they were talking from their hearts. These were things that were personal to them, things that touched their identities. And so if we're going to work on coming together, we got to kind of work with the stuff of one's heart, and that kids, for that reason, were a really great opportunity. Take my dad, for example. When my sister was 4, she wanted to play soccer. He didn't know anything about soccer. Went to the local yard sale, bought her a pair of shin pads and cleats for $4, told her on the car ride over to don't touch the ball with your hands and kick the ball in the other team's goal. She scored 13 goals that game. 16 years later, she's captaining the Georgetown women's soccer team, and my dad is yelling at the ref because that girl was completely offsides. And then in addition to that, kids were very malleable. They were more open to changing their minds about things. And as we talked to teenagers more and more, we realized that kids all over the country, in towns rich and poor, red and blue, urban and rural, were complaining about one common thing. I feel like I'm growing up in a bubble, and I've never seen life outside the bubble. And so we thought, why not go live in a different bubble for a little while? And when we researched where exchange programs come from, they were actually post-World War II peacekeeping tools that were funded by the State Department, began in 1946 with the American Field Service, on the notion that it's going to be hard to build a durable peace in the form of policies if cultures and sort of social relationships are so fractured because of conflict that has existed. And so we need to be getting people together to get to know one another. And that really kicked off this whole idea of study abroad, which is now kind of baked into the way we think of growing up, the way we think of education. I don't think anyone would say that it's not a good idea to go to another country when you're young to see the world. And so we thought, well, why not have that same thing right here in America? Why not instigate the same kind of culture in this country? And so now our vision is to make a week in a different town as much a part of the senior year as the prom or homecoming or the cap and gown that you wear when you graduate.
I mean, I love so much about that, but I've heard you talk about the fact that, like, kids going from Los Angeles to Paris might have more in common than kids going from Los Angeles to Canton, North Carolina, to pick a random spot. You know, I think that that's such an important point. And the other point is that I feel like so many of those ways that we had to bring people together across cultures, across socioeconomic issues, things like the military, things like service, you know, are just not there anymore. So there's just fewer and fewer places to have those conversations with people that are not, you know, just that are different from you.
And
right?
that's a really important point, because those experiences that we have with people who are very different from us teach us things about nuance, about gray area, about the fact that very few things in life are black and white, and that most things are gray. And that those are innate psychological muscles within all of us. It's part of our evolutionary tend to build community with one another, to negotiate, to talk. And for kids who are growing up in homogeneous environments, socioeconomic, cultural, political, those muscles are atrophying because they're deprived of these sorts of experiences. And what's tough is that because they've atrophied, they're going to be more prone to, you know, the social media algorithms that just show you what you want to see and kind of stoke this kind of hyper-partisan behavior. But on the other side of it, like any part of your body that's off or not doing well, you sense that and sense the need to fix it, which is where that sentiment of I feel like I'm growing up in a bubble and I've never seen life outside the bubble is really coming from. So there's a downside, but there's a huge opportunity there at the same time.
Yeah, and I love that they're self-aware that they're growing up in a bubble. That's actually heartening to hear. Adar, I want to bring you into the conversation. You've been helpful in growing AEP, and in particular, you're bringing your expertise in bringing people together, having hard conversations. One of the themes I've heard throughout this conference has been about listening. I'm going back to our very first conversation we had up here yesterday morning only, actually. Political panel that had Zeb Spathers from Canton, North Carolina, talking about rural voters, Olivia Juliana talking about young voters, and I think when asked the question, like, what's the one piece of advice you would give to the Democratic Party, everybody said, you need to listen to us more, right? And so, within that kind of context, Adar, like, what does it look like to listen to each other more? How do we listen to each other more?
Yeah. How, indeed. Thank you, Debbie, for having me. Thank you to the New Deal communities, the staff, the board, all of the leaders. What a lovely time. And truly, I knew because I would follow Debbie anywhere, that when she invited me to come, I should brace for impact on feeling inspired and more hopeful. And truly, you all have delivered. It's been really a gift to be here with you. The listening. I think we make a really natural mistake to think about listening and listening deeply and listening generously. We tend to do that when it feels nice, when it comes naturally, when there's already similarity or commonality or connection. And in those moments, because of our hardwired instinct to belong and to connect, we listen well. We can listen very well. But how do we listen when we don't feel like listening? When there isn't already a relationship or a connection? You know, we generally tend to pull back and pull away from there because it doesn't feel It doesn't feel natural. It may not even feel right. We may not feel like the person deserves to be listened to. I mean, we've talked about misinformation and disinformation. We talked about some really kind of cynical and even cruel approaches to politics that are very much a part of this time. It's really natural for us not to feel generous about listening in those moments, but I think whether or not we can listen when we least feel like listening it really says a lot about where we'll end up as a country and as communities. But how do we start? You know, if there's deadlock or if there's deep mistrust, very little connection to start with, who starts the listening? Who's going to go first? There's no trust. It's a huge act of courage to be the first one to listen. So that's really part of what we're trying to work on, is how can we create the conditions in which, in the case of AEP, young people can lead the way in showing the rest of the country, hey, there are ways that we can listen even when we don't feel like it, and the results of doing so can be really dramatic and transformative. When you listen deeply to someone you don't trust yet, and who doesn't trust you yet, that in itself is one of the most powerful trust-building measures you can take, and it starts to act fast. And you are now in a position of being able to be listened to by a counterpart that would not have been able to do so otherwise, had you not been willing to go first. Now, easy for me to say, I'm not an elected official. I don't sit with the responsibilities that you all do. But as a mediator and as a person who tries to create and sustain really important conversations for people, I've seen firsthand that this is really, it's the most effective and most efficient way, and in some cases it's the only way to move forward. So that, yeah, and I think how to do it is, there's so many ways to go about it. As my uncle Ushang says, there are 100 ways into the garden.
Okay, I have to sit with that one for a minute, but I like it. I want to follow up, though, something I've heard you say other times, and I want to bring it out here on the how. You've taught me this, that silence is okay. That's a big, right? That we want to solve. We're a group of problem solvers. We're a group of action-oriented people.
Yeah.
I find it very difficult to let things sit and let it come to fruition the way it's supposed to. Do you want to say anything about silence?
Silence is tough, because if you're anything like me, and you ask a question in a public forum or a classroom or in a meeting, and 1.5 seconds goes by without a response, you start to panic. I do. It still happens to me. I've trained myself to withstand that period of time and to trust the question I've just asked. Trust the theme that's before the group. Trust the people in the group, and recognize that some people are thinking, is my show on tonight, or is that tomorrow night? You know, oh, where did she get those shoes? I like those shoes. You know, it could be anything. And it's also, oh, is it safe enough for me to give my honest answer? Or do I have to give a different kind of answer? Or let me think for a second. That's a good question. I need to prepare myself. I was thinking about my show, and I hope I shut the oven off this morning, but I think I have an answer to that question. People need time. People need time. So I think the silence is giving people that opening, and also signaling to the group, this is a space, however fleetingly, maybe it's just for the meeting, maybe it's in the organization, maybe it's in the city. This is a space where we can ask genuine questions, and we can think earnestly about them, and then we can come forward before one another with courage and really share what we're thinking. If we rush away from silence, if we blurt something out, if we rephrase the question, if we start answering it a little bit because we think that'll jog people's imaginations and get their vocal cords going, we're basically telling the group, I don't trust you. I'm going to handle this because that 1.5 seconds just gave me enough reason not to trust you to come back to me with something. And particularly across difference, silence, all the good moments of breakthrough, of connection, of recognition, of validation, of apology, when people summon their moral imagination and then have the courage to articulate it, those things never come out of a quick back and forth. Those things always happen after a brief pause or a longer pause that to the person holding the meeting feels a lot longer than it is.
Super helpful, thank you. David, I want to go back to you about the program a little bit. You talked about a couple words there I want to draw out: honesty, courage. So another theme that we've talked a lot about over the course of the last 2 days is authenticity, and being able to be vulnerable, to let our guard down. We've been talking about kind of not projecting something that we think people want to see, but really letting people see us. I don't want to assume anything. I'm going to ask a question. What is it like for the kids in this program who are going to really different places, and what does it look like when they are confronted with things that they are that are new to them, and how do you get them to, or just how do they naturally show themselves to each other?
Yeah, it's hard to find out who you are until you've figured out who you aren't. And it's very hard to, when you've grown up in an environment that is all you've ever known, a great way to kind of distinguish yourself, figure out what makes you you, is to get yourself out of that environment and into another one. So not only do our students travel to a town that's very different from the one that they're growing up in, they do it alone, so they're the only person from their town to go, and they do it with a group of 12 other people, generally, who are also from different towns. So in other words, I can't cling to my best friend Adar from my hometown because we have our thing and we know how we do our thing and we're just comfortable that way. This is your own individual journey. It's your kind of hero's journey where you venture out from home, take on adventures, take on fun, take on challenges, and come back. And in the end, the whole experience is kind of acted like a mirror where you can look at yourself and say, this is what I'm about and this is what I'm not about. We try to create a space in the program, or spaces. We're in 60 locations across the country. Many towns that are here today, actually, we looked at the list, we're in your communities, in which it's focused on fun and on curiosity and on elevating the things about us that are great, and also being honest about the things that are hard and contextualizing everything. We've found that a lot of people's beliefs don't come from opinions they've derived from metadata or deep research, but from their lived experiences. And that our lived experiences are deeply shaped by the circumstances in which we live. And for kids, it's the circumstances in which they've grown up, which they didn't get to pick. And in a country that's as large as ours is, we live in a country the size of a continent. Most states are bigger than most countries. Are the circumstances that are existing in this country and people's lived experiences are just massively different from one another. And so we are creating situations in which kids can go rafting or climb a mountain and have lunch and organically start talking about the fact that, oh my God, I've never seen a cow in real life, which, by the way, 54% of this nation's young people have never seen a cow in real life. And so because it comes up organically, it touches a really important part of what Adar was talking about, which is the phenomenon that makes us listen naturally, which is curiosity. And I would encourage you that if there's someone you're really having a hard time getting along with, find something about them to be curious about. It can be, where did you get those shoes? I really like your shoes. But find something. And the whole program is designed to get kids out of an environment that they're familiar with and into one so that it arouses curiosity, which shows appreciation, and validation, which is very important. Gets them a little bit uncomfortable so that their courage is acting, and then also welcomes them in. The most powerful piece of the AEP experience, and experiences like this, is the phenomenon of a little bit nervous, scared, and excited teenager getting off an airplane in a place that is totally foreign to them and arriving at the home of two parents who are different from their own and very similar to their own. And there's a bed that's been made for you, and a shower towel that's been folded at the end of the bed, and a hot meal waiting on the table, and it's welcome to Kansas. We're so thrilled to have you. How was your flight? And that show of kindness and humanity completely contradicts every fear that they're having about rejection and being pushed away, and really now every narrative about a very divided, angry country that's at war with itself. and is instead this deeply gratifying show of humanity and connection that becomes a counter-narrative to everything else. So that for years later, when kids hear the word Wyoming or the New England, or even rich, poor, Republican, Democrat, they're thinking about that moment when the door was open and the bed was made and the hot meal was at the table for them. And they're not thinking about the prevailing narratives that we see out there right now.
And they've also gone home and they've told their family about their experience, right? A high school kid's parents are going to be fairly dialed in to what their AEP exchange was all about. How are you doing? How was it? What happened? So there's also this impact on the family ecosystem and on the community the kid traveled from. Let's say in Palo Alto, that says, well, they really took care of Carl.
All of a sudden these kids come home and suddenly Jackson, Mississippi, or Little Rock, Arkansas, or Wellesley, Massachusetts are the greatest places in the world. And Mom, guess what? I've commandeered the family vacation next year. We're going on a road trip through Texas. Like that's happened many times over through the program. And it's because of these shows of affirmation and validation.
But can you talk maybe about, to take a step backwards a little bit, like kind of your theory, you're hitting on it, I think, but your theory of change. Like, what is it that ultimately, in the short run, it's what we've been talking about with these kids and this new experience. I've heard you both use the words, we're going to complicate these kids' worldviews, which I really love and would love to maybe you talk about a little bit. But like, what is your big vision? What do you see happening in this country because of programs like this?
I think innovations and big ideas are something that this country does best. I mean, think about public libraries, for example. At the turn of the 20th century, illiteracy was a major issue in this country and a huge barrier to economic inequality. Innovation, philanthropy, and really Andrew Carnegie, across 40 years, built 2,000 public libraries. And as public libraries were built around the country, guess what happened to illiteracy? It went like that. The airplane, I mean, you can go rattle off, right? Penicillin, 911, Alcoholics Anonymous. We're really good at creating things that can meet a moment. And I'm hoping that AEP can be the defining social innovation of the decade. And we want to make this experience kind of a ritual, the way Little League is a ritual. And what we see happening and what we believe, and I don't want to call it a bet, but our deep conviction is that the majority of Americans are really good people who, under the right circumstances, when brought together, will get along with one another and come to appreciate one another. And so really what we're trying to do is just bring different people together. It's manifest from contact theory, which is a sociological hypothesis from a guy named Gordon Allport, who's a sociologist in the 1950s, studied the civil rights movement, and found that when he brought different groups of people together under the right circumstances, their beliefs necessarily didn't change, but their prejudices went away. And prejudice, I think, really is the issue here. It's what's kind of putting the flaps over our ears and preventing us from hearing one another because we can't see beyond what we already think about folks. And so in a way, this program can be, a massive antidote to prejudice, which will have, as we're already seeing, huge implications for depolarization, but also economic equality through economic connectedness. I mean, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. We have a kid from San Francisco who goes to culinary school in New York and said no thanks to Paris and London and instead went to Sioux Falls, South Dakota for his first job in a restaurant. We have students flying from downtown Denver to go tour colleges in Massachusetts. And then on top of that, we're looking at a major teen mental health crisis, and we're discovering that connection and belonging and adult mentors and healthy friendships, three-dimensional friendships, not just the 2D friendships we see on the phones, are key to all of that. And so I think AEP can be this ritual that is going to connect what is inherently always going to be a very large and very diverse country that's always going to be prone to fracture along lines of politics, class, race, ethnicity. And if we can create socializing experiences across those lines, it'll be huge. And on top, and the kicker is that every one student that travels connects with 30 other people. So those are 30 people in these communities who are hearing stories about what it's like to grow up in Riggins, Idaho, or Muskogee, Oklahoma, or the Bronx. Those are 30 people that are considering a corner of life that they've never considered before, or certainly have never heard about from a real person that's standing in their kitchen or on their ranch or in their place of work. And so while we had 300 kids travel last summer, we had thousands of people touched by the program, most immediately parents and host families and other kids.
Can I stay with you for a second to ask you, so about, you do this program and it's almost because they're living this experience, they're seeing something different, they're kind of learning it. You were telling me that you don't necessarily sit them down and say, hey, we're going to talk about this social issue. Like, what did you grow up believing? What did you grow up believing? Go, right? That's not how it works. Talk a little bit about how that manifests itself in the program. And then, Dar, I want to come back to you about kind of advice for our leaders about leading difficult conversations. But first, in the context of so I'm giving you a warning to think about that. But for the program, like what does it actually look like in practice to have these kids kind of learning from each other? Or what are they taking away?
So it begins at the very beginning of the program. You know, we do not walk into schools, stand on stage, and say, "Okay, who wants to empathize with a Republican this summer?" Instead, we walk in and say, "Hey, who wants to be the ticket taker at the rodeo in Sheridan, Wyoming, in July?" Show of hands, and generally the vast majority go up. And then, as we go through the week, you know, first, the country is so huge and diverse that automatically, I had a professor in college say that your antenna are never higher than when you're traveling, and that's certainly been validated when we see these kids. We focus a lot on really 4 types of activities: cultural immersion, summer events and activities. By the way, if you're looking to travel, there are an innumerable amount of chili cook-offs and rattlesnake roundups and wild hog cook-offs and rodeos and state fairs and farmers markets happening all across America. They're all great. Go. It's terrific. It's also the best way to embed a kid in a community. And so we are facilitating these experiences along the lines of cultural immersion, community events. We do a lot of volunteer and service, connecting with local professionals that are all meant to arouse curiosity and socializing. And as they do, these kids are so different and have grown up with such different realities that organically conversations come up along the lines of difficult topics. So abortion might come up. But more than that, your public school is so nice. Mine wasn't like this. Is that fair? You have so many Teslas. Or how is it that your principal allows a Black Lives Matter flag to be hung from the walls of your high school? We would never allow that. Or, petrochemical plants. I mean, what's that thing over there? And they start talking about it, and they start unveiling these issues slowly. They run into them. It's inevitable. But what's happened as a byproduct of the experience is that they've become friends first. And so in their heads is this understanding that I can accept a world that's black and white, good and bad, and what you think is wrong, what I think is right, and if I do that, I'm going to lose you as a friend. Or I can accept that maybe there's some nuance to the area, and that your beliefs are the product of your lived experiences, which I don't quite understand. So I'm going to offer a few questions, and I'm going to be open-minded to it, and I'm going to keep a friend and have a more dynamic worldview as a byproduct of it. And we hire teachers in each of our communities to kind of quarterback these exchanges, and so they're watching over these situations, and basically, thanks to training with this one right here, understanding how to facilitate these conversations. And sometimes facilitation is stepping back and saying nothing. Sometimes it's putting a pin in it because it's getting too hot, and we're going to wait till the campfire later, and we're going to have a much more organized conversation about this.
That's really great. Dar, I'm going to open it up for a couple questions before we wrap, but so let me ask you the last question up here from me. How do we take all of what David just talked about, which is so inspiring? I want to go back and do this program, and certainly want my kids to do it. How do we take that, and kind of what lessons are you going to give to elected officials how can they either start engaging people in hard conversations, or how can they create conditions where hard conversations can happen? Like, you've been here all 2 days, so you've heard everything, you know everything.
No, I don't know a thing. I don't know the first thing. But I can share with you one of the most powerful lessons I learned. It was a great fortune, a huge blessing for me to spend some time with Maya Angelou, who told me, and not just me, she told the world, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. I hear some people already know. And that's what I have to say. So if that's the idea, if that's the watchword, I'll ask you, how can you create the conditions in which people can be together and feel as though their counterparts, that vilified other, can understand them, is worth trusting? How do we create those conditions? Now, I think it has a lot to do with sowing the seeds of curiosity. When we feel genuinely curious about other people, it's hard for us to be clenched and braced for conflict if we're actually curious. But we're not really in a curious mood when we're angry. So how do we bring that about? How do we create those conditions? I think it's maybe disappointingly simple. We have to ask really good questions. We have to ask irresistible questions. So when we convene, can we use not just irresistible, but also unexpected questions? Questions that maybe knock people just a bit off of their center. That they're surprised and have a sense that this is a live moment. Something real might happen here. I might be more understood if I engage here. And because I'm sort of off-center just a bit and maybe leaning forward a bit, maybe I'm ready to understand someone else in a deeper way. We could ask something like, what do people get wrong about you? What kind of question is that? When do we ask such a question? It's almost shocking. It feels obtuse. That question saved my life in a very difficult meeting with stakeholders who were really far apart. What do people get wrong about you is built into that question. Let's look at it for just a second. Built into the question is the assumption that this person has been misunderstood. That's a compassionate and generous thing to say to someone. I understand, you've probably been misunderstood. But also in the question, tell us, where's the mix-up? How do you want to be understood? We're here to listen. So thoughtfully worded and efficiently asked questions with enough silence to signal to everyone in the room, not just the people being asked directly. We do mean to ask the question, and we intend to wait for a genuine response. This is not a pageant. This is not a checklist of questions. We're not rushing through this experience. And then I think also there's a tendency when we gather with adversaries or counterparts to try to set the record straight, to litigate, to defend ourselves, to correct things that were not truthful, to look for justice. All that is very natural, very human. That's just what it is. And yet it does a disservice to the primary objective, which should be to establish trust and connection first. Because if trust and connection is established first, then listening and hearing becomes possible. Without any trust and connection, people can talk a lot, and it's all going to just wash over everybody. So when I did work in Belfast following the Good Friday Agreement, the question couldn't be, what were you thinking when you planted the explosives outside of, that was just going to reactivate everything. The question needed to be something like, what kind of a future do you hope for your grandchildren in the city of Belfast? A forward-looking question that everyone can answer. And by the way, you're going to have a lot of overlap in the answers you hear. You build common ground immediately that way. Where are we going? What are we hoping for?
So powerful. I'm going to send you to Congress. Can you fix that? I'm going to overrule and say we're going to do a question or two. Christine.
I have a question. Christine Hunchowski.
Oh, sorry, Christine.
Hi, I'm Christine Hunchowski, a state rep in the state of Florida. I was the mayor of Parkland when the shooting happened. And a couple of things. So you talked about, people being in their bubble. You talked about listening deeply and generously. Yet we're in sometimes a very toxic environment. We're in a very transactional environment. We're in an environment where people tell us all the time how great we are because they need us to push the green button for them. So even if we're not talking about people on the other side of an aisle, even in our own aisle, how do we create that environment of trust and connection with actual deep and generous listening? I
think the timely answer, given what we've been talking about, is working with young people. Is, I think, a systemic and sound strategy. But to answer your question in earnest, I think rethinking how we gather and how we convene, changing the game. I mean, if the meeting or the forum or I'm not sure exactly what kinds of moments you're imagining when you ask your question, but they're designed. They have constraints and opportunities built into them that we tend to assume and take for granted. It's how we've always done things. When I'm working with a large business, they're used to divisions meeting in this way and the C-suite reporting in this way and managers go this, and it's all by choice. So we can actually re-engineer how we talk if we're serious about getting a different outcome, and we may need to. But that's maybe an unsatisfying answer because it requires so much restructuring that we may or may not have the capacity to undertake.
I also might add, getting to know the people that you're talking about as people and not whoever they're showing up to be when they're interacting with you. If you think about the questions Adar's just offered, what do people get wrong about you? What's your hope for the future? Those are little keys trying to unlock the door that someone is locking so that they're only showing you one side of themselves because they have an objective for that. And they're unlocking the door to get you to know that person more in a more dynamic way. People can be afraid to do that, but once you push through that, it's actually a real show of sincerity. I want to get to know you. I want to work with you. I want to make this happen, and I want to align our interests. Our intentions are aligned. Maybe the outcome might be different. Maybe what we're going to bring to the table might be a little bit different, but that's okay, because in the end, we're all in it together, and I believe that. And I think that's what people are missing right now. I think they're missing the trust and understanding that the person sitting across from me, on my half of the aisle or not, truly believes that we are all in this together and that the outcome is going to affect us all equally. And so to find ways to push through that and to get to know people is key. And the bad news is that it takes often a lot of work and a lot of patience on the person taking the onus to do that. It means you have to put yourself out there and take the risk before somebody else is going to do that themselves. And it's not always going to reap a reward. But it's the only way, I've found doing it. And one thing we believe at AEP is that culture permeates, right, from the student all the way on up to the board. So I'm facilitating an organization that's in 35 states, that has every realm of diversity that this country could have, and we all have to work together to get the job done. So we're dealing with this a lot too. And the only way I've found to do it is to get to know people as people, and to have a very understanding wife, because I often need to work late and travel a lot. So.
Is there one other question?
Yes. I thought you'd never ask. How do you sign up to be part of the American Exchange Project? So we have a website, americanexchangeproject.org. I also brought business cards there in my backpack. We are expanding all the time. We've tripled in size in the last couple of years. We're growing very, very quickly. And there's a lot of opportunity to bring AEP to your community, to your high school, to even be a host family. If you've got some kids that you're hoping to get out of the house this summer, let us know. So you can visit the website or just, come see me.
Could you give a round of applause to David and Madar?